School Online for the Lemoyne Center. As you recall, I am your teacher for history, and my name is Mr. Bauhof. Now, let's get started. We're going to teach you a little bit about county history. Before we get started, there are two things really that I really want to establish with all yins to establish why it's so important to study not just big things in history like, massive wars, which we'll touch on, but also smaller things too, like local history. Alright, so number one, why do we study local history? I know that during an election year like this, people start talking about national issues. Who are the United States really at their heart, at their core? What do we really believe to be true about our nation? What things do we not believe to be true about our nation? What is the whole point of it all? Now, that's important in the national issue, but you also have to bear in mind what local, nearby, individual provinces are like. Why and why not? Okay, so, reasons threefold that you should be interested in your local government. Number one, your voice is more likely to be heard at a local level than at a national level. Why? Well, pretty simple. Because there's less people around. I mean, think about it. Let's say you're in a crowd of 100 people, and you're all watching something, something unfold. Perhaps, something you agree with or something you disagree with. A debate, perhaps. When there's only 100 people around, it's easier for your individual voice to be heard, and easier for everyone else around you to know why you're approaching the way you are. But once you get into numbers as big as America, 400 million people almost, that's where that's where your voice can be drowned out. There could be millions and millions of speakers. I can't even tell you the last time that I've heard any form of any political movement that hasn't been drowned out in a giant wave of other voices coming in. It's very difficult to have one distinct voice. Second reason, not only is it easier for your voice to be heard, but it's also easier to get in contact with a local politician. I mean, think about it. If anyone in this class, myself included, called up the White House, or even the governor, what are the odds he's going to take our call? 0! Alright? Chances are, it's just going to go through to someone on a board who's going to write it down, and they're going to take all of our complaints and all of our opinions and all of our advice and our congratulations, they're going to whittle it down into a list, and that's what he may or may not get. Reason number 3 to care more about local events. It has a more direct impact on you. Here's why. So let's say they pass a bill tomorrow, and the bill says that we're gonna cut down on logging. If you're in a logging community, you'll still be affected, but only in the really vaguest of terms. So that's sort of that triad there is the real reason. It's because it gives you you have more influence and more impact and more of an effect based on local politics than, say, international politics. That's why we're going to study the County of Washington and how Pennsylvania sort of structures into history as a whole. We are going to study international history a little bit too, just going to touch on some things like Frederick the Great or Frederick II, as he's sometimes called. But mostly I want you to be able to know what your community was like just a couple hundred years ago. However, before I get started, I want to explain something called the evolution of culture. Now, do not be confused. When I talk about the evolution of culture, I am not really going to make an argument that is moral. This isn't about good guys versus bad guys. This is not the heroes versus the villains. Alright? Especially when it comes to politics. Things are never simple. Things are never straightforward. And things are never, let's use the term, things are never interchangeable. And by that I just mean you can't really pop into a time machine, go back in time, and change the way things were. There are lots of moments, instances, where someone does something that in hindsight seems really stupid, but you can't do anything about that. Alright, so mostly this is about, and once more when I use evolution, I'm not talking about evolution biologically, I'm talking about cultural evolution. That is the theory that over time, certain themes, techniques, information, how do I put this? There are certain habits, that's a good way of putting it, there are certain habits that cultures really develop and use. As an example, in America, America has always been money-centric. Alright, you look at ancient Britain, ancient Senegal, ancient Egypt, okay, they were empires, and empires come because they have emperors. Well, where do emperors come from? Well, they were kings who came out of groups of tribes that grouped together, and then the king conquers another area, let's say Seleucia. Okay, so, there's a guy in Habsburg, and he conquers a little adjacent area, and then he becomes an emperor. That's how it works. It's that over time, certain things within that system do work, and other things don't work. And in America, the thing that has always driven us, from the time that Columbus touched down on the soil of North America, not the continental North America, I know, all the way until today, the running theme has been that we are, at our core, a corporation. Now, is this right? Is it wrong? What's the moral stance? That's not the point. Okay, it's perfectly moral. It is moral to help someone who's sickly and dying. But in evolution, the sick and the dying die, and the healthy and strong survive. Nature of the beast. So, please divorce the concept of morality from this, just so that you understand that this is just about what works, not really about who a good guy is or who a bad guy is. I know that in hindsight we sort of look at good and bad because we identify with one person and not another, but that's not really what's happening here. Let's talk about Pennsylvania now. Alright, so as you all know, Pennsylvania was founded before America was even a nation. We raised ourselves up. And I'm sure that you've already heard about Philadelphia's Independence Hall. But how did America really backtrack itself? So I'm going to be reading portions of the Declaration of Independence towards the end of this to sort of give you the end point of it. But I want you to bear in mind that what brought America to where it is had a lot to do with forces outside of itself. So, quick summation of the world as is. I mentioned a little province called Seleucia earlier, which was being run by a guy by the name of Frederick II, or Frederick the Great. He was a Prussian king. Now, you're probably thinking, where's Prussia? Who are these people? Basically, Prussia was what eventually would become Germany. But, once more, you run into the empire problem. Okay, so he becomes king of these little, just a bunch of little states that all group together. The problem with an empire, or the problem with all empires, is that empires are all about consuming their neighbors. And that, in the long run, it sort of, it becomes so big you have to fail. So let's say you've got a bunch of tribes here, okay? And then as, these tribes start to, they come together, they coalesce, they make a king. And the king sort of runs things. That's not so big of an issue. The problem is that as each and every king is around you, your little king then starts feuding with the other kings. And when this king conquers the next king, he gets to be an emperor. The problem with this cultural evolution is that then every other king realizes that by conquering another king, they can become an emperor. And then they get even bigger. So then it becomes this bizarre problem where everyone is consuming everyone else. And you're probably thinking, okay, well, what happens? You've got a king here, and he conquers another king, and then he becomes an emperor, and then that king conquers another king, and that it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. You eventually win as you conquer the whole world. Here's a problem with that. As these kings conquer more and more people, local politics come up. Okay, so you conquer Belgium, or you conquer Prussia, or you go to war against England, and you conquer a little bit of area. However much area you conquer, you then have to defend from every other king. And while you're doing so, you then have that little area that maybe doesn't want to be part of yours. Now, I'm not going to go and get all weird about nationalism because so many people have done that lately. There's no point. But what does need to be stated here is that nationalism as a human system, very vague, right? A product of cultural evolution, is actually quite potent in the political forum. So what you'll find that kicked off World War I was a form of nationalism. There was a guy who said, "We're not Austrians. I'm going to shoot this Austrian guy to prove I'm not Austrian." Is it right? Is it wrong? Not the point. The point is that within his system, he didn't see himself as Austrian. And therefore, he has to rebel. Has to. Which leads to chaos and war. And that's what's going to happen here. That as Frederick the Great begins amassing more and more power in his local arena, and he starts taking over a little adjacent area to his own to try and make himself bigger, he ends up kicking off a massive, massive war. Here's how. So, for those of you who know, we speak the English language. Why? Because we were a British colony. So, and this is the other problem that I mentioned about local politics when it comes to empiricism. So an empire conquers a little area. And so then you have these eternal kings all vying against each other. Going back centuries, England and France were just at each other's throats all the time. It was almost like they had nothing else to do. I mean, there's poetry going back like half a millennia about how much they hated each other, couldn't stand each other. So, and Frederick the Great goes and takes on his cousin. And they start feuding with each other. He wants to take over this little area, which the name I shall give you so that you can spell it out for yourself. He was from Prussia, as I mentioned, and they also called him Old Fritz. I believe it's Seleuci. Let me make sure I've got the correct spelling here. 1 second. So, Sollosi, I believe. Here is the issue. As he starts taking over this adjacent area, he gets into a fight with an Austrian. Silesia. I pronounce it Silesia, but Silesia. There we go. My apologies. So, as he takes over this adjacent area, he starts fighting with Austria about it. England and France both decide to take a side in this war. Right? England takes his opponent's side, and Prussia takes a side with France. After the war ends, and nobody's happy about it, England is trying to pressure their ally into accepting the other guy. They said, look, there's really no reason for us to, keep this war going. Wars are expensive and time-consuming. Meanwhile, the Prussian guy, King Frederick, is kind of, does not accept it. So, even because this war was waged and no one actually, finished it out, they end up going back into it. Here's how that happened. These massive empires that were forming, England and France, like I said, have been warring for forever. They couldn't conquer each other. They were too big. And here's where the problem comes in. France invades England. They carve out a little area for a little bit. And then the English fight back. And then the English try and conquer France. And then they get booted. And back and forth and back and forth and back and forth for hundreds and hundreds of years until they eventually come to the conclusion that they can't do it to each other. So they start doing it all around the world. France takes over portions of Asia. They have scouts in North America who are doing trading with the indigenous peoples there. They've got stuff in Africa, Senegal, as an example. They've got a little bit of stuff going on in South America, but that was more the Portuguese and the Spanish. I promise you all these ties will be together. In North America, things got heated because as the British colonies, which we were one, start expanding, they start bumping up against the French, which leads to a conflict. Well, now that the French and the English are fighting in America, it sparks what is known as 7-Year War. Which, depending on how you count it, could have lasted as long as 23 years, but that's another discussion altogether. The point here being that because just one little fight happens in North America, then it spreads to South America, and then it spreads into Europe, and once it hits Europe, that's where everything it gets hit like a line of dominoes. Because all those kings in Europe always had all their guts out for each other. Prussia wants to fight France, and France wants to fight Russia, and Russia wants to fight England. They've all got their guns pointed at each other, and so the second that the Americans say, we want to expand just a little bit, it kicks off was basically the First World War. There were fights from Hong Kong all the way to Washington, Pennsylvania, where we are now. Eurasia, Africa, North and South America were all involved in this war. It was, in many ways, the First World War. It happened in the 19th century. Well, actually, it happened in the late 18th century. Here's how that all kind of bore out. Prussia did survive it. Even though the British and the Prussians were enemies during the First War, they swapped sides because the British said the Prussians are going to survive, so we'd rather have peace with them, which meant that he decided to deal with them, which meant that the Prussians' enemies, the Austrians, decided to deal with France in order to get back in order to get back at the British. So, because the French and the British hate each other, they then have to take a side in a war that has nothing to do with them. Which means that a war in North America spreads into Europe, and then through Europe they then start fighting it out through their colonies, they start fighting the Caribbean, they start fighting in Asia. And this is one of the big problems. Now, one of the cool things about these empires is that they opened up worldwide commerce. You could be living in England and have access to Chinese art and Indian philosophy and pelts from North America. Very cool. You know, you'd have all these products coming in. Commerce was going. On the other hand, because you got little colonies all over the place, you then start these massive wars. And so this whole house of cards comes tumbling down. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the details about this guy and that guy because frankly it was a world war. It was a war across the entire globe. So you're not actually going to need the blow-by-blow in individual battles because that's too complicated. We only have about 25 minutes here, and I've already burned through about 15 minutes of it. So I will summarize on this. Because of how expensive and destructive war is, the colonies ended up turning against their home nation. In North America, after the British kind of rounded everything out, the British basically won. Britain thought they ran the world. They were going to control India, they were going to control large portions of Africa, and on North America, they basically had it set. The problem is that people in North America had that local politics thing kick in again. They said, you know what? I mean, think about their thinking at the time. People like Daniel Boone. George Washington was involved in the war, in the 7 Years' War. They sat down and they said, you know what? Daniel Boone himself, a famous frontiersman, lost one of his sons during this war. Washington lost some of his men. And the nation itself, the colonies, had experienced the hardship of losing both their sons and daughters, because that's what happens in war, people die. And they then got hit with taxes in order to pay for it. Well, let me ask you a question here. Let's say that you were actually there. Put yourself in the shoes of someone like Daniel Boone who fought this war. Why is it that I have to have some guy from England have me fight this war that I don't want to fight and pay for this war that I don't want to fight in the first place in order to fund a government not of my own? They grew frustrated. They got tired of the politics. I mean, think about it. Well, once more, your voice is going to be drowned out. You think that it's hard to get your voice heard in America today. Imagine if America was stretched across 4 continents. So these taxes start passing. They pass the Stamp Act, they tax tea, and each time they start taxing this stuff, the colonists get a little bit more frustrated. Well, taxing me. You're taking my money to fund your war machine to get my son killed, to get me killed. Why do I want to do this? Well, because you have to. You're a colony. This is where the Declaration of Independence comes in. And one of the reasons I wanted to read it today, and next week when we meet back, we'll be talking a little bit more about we'll be talking about the Whiskey Rebellion and how it is, in fact, reminiscent very much of this particular conflict. So, here it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay. I'm going to take a pause here. I'm going to start going piece by piece. Number one, American rights are self-evident. This is an important concept that we cooked up in our heads. Once more, it's that cultural evolution thing. If you sit down and try and figure out what your rights, quote-unquote, should be, you can lose those rights. I mean, think about it. Okay, let me put it like this, because I know that I'm running out of time. So, in the comments today, I'm going to ask, what are some things that should be self-evident? You know? So, I'll give you an example. Free speech. People argue about this all the time. When do we limit speech? You can't. The second you say, you can't say the word, Solosi. I'm pretty sure I'm mispronouncing it. If you tell me that, you know what I can do? I can say it again. Because it's self-evident that I have the capacity to speech. Okay. Well, if it's self-evident that I can do these things, and it's equal across all peoples, right? Basically anyone who's a human being has the capacity for language. Then we're all created equal. And another important one here is endowed by a creator God. Now this part actually is a lot less religious than you may expect. Their basic agreement on providence is as follows. Maybe there was a God that did this stuff, but we don't have to fight over theology. This is actually kind of an important concept because what they're saying is your rights didn't come from the president, and it doesn't come from a piece of paper. It comes from something beyond humanity that we have no control over. Whether that's a literal being or whether that's just a concept doesn't matter. The point is that you shouldn't be able to tell me I don't have the right to speech, as an example. In closing, because I know I'm running out of time here, I know there's a lot of disparate parts. Your involvement in the local government matters because, like I said, you need your voice to be heard. I'd like to think that America is very far away from the 7 Years' War. That we don't have a far-off government that's involving us in endless wars across 4 different continents that's racking up a massive, massive bill. You know, of huge, almost unbelievable debt. And that they're going to pass massive, gargantuan taxes against the American people and won't pay for these things. But we're never really that far away from that, ever, because that's how life is. But really what you should learn about cultural evolution is that we need to learn from these lessons from our history so that we don't repeat them again in the future. Now, the reason I mentioned rights isn't just that Americans have a unique sense on rights, but they also say that American individuals have the right to dissolve their government. I'm going to be very careful with my speech here, because, you know, this is a very sensitive topic. Okay? That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation of such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So the first portion they make here about the government is that the English government isn't the government because it's the government. It's the government because the people allow it. And they can get rid of it, or they can change it at will, which is a right that you have. You can alter your government, and you can abolish it, but there's another part attached to this. So whenever someone says, oh, let's just get rid of the government, remember this next part. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. So, in closing, here's sort of my point about the 7 Years' War, how to fix you. These governments, these kings that become emperors that constantly vie in power against each other. Please do not forget, as bad as they were, simply abolishing them wasn't the solution. You have to first do what the American government did, which was to try and petition their local government to change things. Yes, in America it worked out really nicely for us. We managed to turn things around, and next week during our talk about the Whiskey Rebellion, you'll see that there was a lot of stuff going on that made it really complex, that really turned this nation from chaos into order. But that didn't happen in France. In France, they had the Reign of Terror. Not as much fun as it sounds. They killed people. They were just murdering people, rounding up almost random individuals off the street and executing them. Why? Because evil proliferates when you just abolish a government. And these have happened in revolutions all over the world. North America, South America, there have been so many revolutions. Africa has had a bunch of them. Europe, I already mentioned France. And Russia. It's believed 120 million people died because of one revolution. In China, 20 million people starved to death because of the Glorious Revolution. Do not just overthrow the government. First try and alter it. Then make sure that when we're pursuing safety and happiness, we put something in place that can actually take care of the American people.